Patricia Hallowell stood at the edge of my dock, clipboard in hand, smirking like she'd already won. "This structure violates community guidelines," she said, her voice dripping with that smug authority only an HOA president could fake. Behind her, two officers shifted uncomfortably, summoned because she'd called 911 over 20 feet of weathered boards that had been here longer than her fancy imported SUV. Patricia tapped her pen against the notice and added, "You'll either remove it by Friday or face daily fines and a lien on your property." I didn't flinch. My eyes stayed locked on hers. "Funny thing about deadlines," I said, my voice steady. "This dock predates the bylaws you're citing. In fact, I've got permits stamped by the county long before Clearwater Shores was ever incorporated." Her smirk faltered for the briefest second. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to know she hadn't expected resistance this early. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I straightened, the lake wind tugging at my shirt. "Name's Ethan Ward," I continued, my voice calm, unshaken. "Forensic accountant. My father built this place with his own hands after serving 30 years in the Navy, and I'll be damned if I let anyone, especially an HOA president, erase that legacy because you think your rules matter more than the law." Patricia shifted her weight, eyes narrowing, but she didn't say a word. The wood beneath my boots creaked as I stepped closer to the waterline. Every nail, every plank of that dock carried memory. My father teaching me to cast a line with steady patience, his voice low and calm. The afternoon I scattered flowers where he once sat, the sun burning gold across the ripples. The quiet nights I came out alone, just to hear the water slap against the posts. To me, this wasn't wooden bolts. It was the last living piece of him. Patricia might see a code violation, but I saw my father's promise. "Where are you watching from?" I asked softly, eyes never leaving hers. She thought she could intimidate me with citations, threats, and flashing lights from the cruiser parked at the cul-de-sac. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that numbers tell stories, and I'd already seen hers. Budgets with gaps too wide to ignore. Contracts funneled to companies nobody recognized. A reserve fund that smelled like rot beneath polished spreadsheets. Patricia might have called 911 on my dock, but she'd just triggered the kind of fight I was built for. I gave her one last look, calm as stone. "Patricia," I said evenly, "you've picked the wrong man to make an example of." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be, because deep down, I already knew. The dock was just the beginning, and the real storm was still coming. Patricia's heels clicked, hard against the wooden planks as she turned away, muttering something to the officers about non-compliance. They followed reluctantly, their eyes catching mine for a brief second, and I could read it in their faces. They knew this wasn't worth the call. When her SUV finally pulled out of the cul-de-sac, silence returned, broken only by the soft slap of water against the posts of my father's dock. But in that silence, I knew one thing. She wasn't finished. Patricia never made threats without a plan to escalate. By the next morning, the proof was plastered on the community bulletin board at the entrance to Clearwater Shores. A bright red notice stapled dead center read, "Dock in violation, hazardous structure, HOA fines accruing daily until removal." The wording was pure theater. Hazardous structure was her way of painting me as reckless, even dangerous to my neighbors. And judging by the sideways glances I got from joggers and dog walkers passing the board, Patricia's smear campaign had already taken root. I stood there a moment, arms crossed, watching as Marjorie Lane shuffled up with her little terrier. "Ethan," she whispered, lowering her voice as though Patricia might be hiding in the azaleas. "Don't let her scare you. That dock's as sturdy as the day your daddy built it. Everyone knows she's just flexing because she thinks no one can stop her." Her words gave me strength, but they also revealed something deeper, fear. Marjorie wasn't just being kind, she was warning me that others had been targeted before. Broken fences cited as safety hazards, rose bushes labeled landscape violations. Even a neighbor's flagpole once ordered down. Patricia's reach extended into every yard, and people had learned it was easier to fold than to fight. That pattern mattered. If Patricia was bold enough to drag police to my dock, then she was confident nobody would challenge her authority. which meant she wasn't just controlling people, she was hiding something big. Patterns leave trails, and I'd built my career on tracing trails others thought invisible. Numbers, dates, signatures. They couldn't lie, even if people did. I walked back toward my house, eyes scanning every mailbox and porch light. This community had become a stage for Patricia's power plays. Every small violation notice was a performance. Every public shaming a signal to the rest of us. Comply or suffer. But bullies always overreach. And last night, when she called 911 over a dock that had outlived 2 generations, she gave me my opening. Inside, I spread out the HOA newsletter on the kitchen table. Most homeowners barely skimmed it, but I read every line. Buried under cheerful blurbs about summer picnics and landscaping reminders were the numbers, monthly assessments, reserve contributions, and vague references to special project allocations. They looked harmless at first glance, but the totals shifted oddly from month to month, round numbers where there shouldn't be. Whole categories listed without detail. My fingers traced the page like I was reading Braille, feeling the gaps in her story. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen as I leaned back, staring at the dock through the window. Patricia wanted everyone to see me as stubborn, clinging to a hazard. But I wasn't the only one watching. Neighbors peeked from curtains, wondering if I'd cave or stand tall. This fight wasn't just about boards and bolts anymore. It was about every family in Clearwater Shores who'd bent under her rule. If I exposed her, it wouldn't just save my dock. It could free the whole neighborhood. Marjorie's words echoed again. Everyone knows she's just flexing because she thinks no one can stop her. That was the heart of it. Patricia built her empire on fear, but fear collapses fast when truth hits daylight. And truth was the one thing I carried like a weapon. I pushed the newsletter aside and whispered to the empty kitchen, "Patricia, you just picked the wrong accountant to mess with." The lake shimmered in the distance, as if my father himself was nodding in approval. I wasn't just defending wood and water. I was about to uncover something much bigger. The next evening, I made my way to the small HOA office tucked behind the clubhouse. Its walls were painted the same sterile beige as every hallway in Clearwater Shores, an intentional blandness meant to suggest order. But order was the last thing I felt walking into that room. A row of empty folding chairs lined the wall, and at the center desk sat Tom Delgado, the treasurer, hunched over a stack of reports. His pen tapped nervously against the paper, rapid fire, like a metronome counting down seconds he didn't want to spend here. He glanced up when I entered, and his shoulders tensed. Not in hostility, but like someone caught between 2 opposing forces, each one tugging at him harder than the other. "Ethan," he said quietly, not rising. His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, as though even speaking to me was an act of risk. I pulled out one of the chairs and sat across from him. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer ink. "I saw the notice Patricia posted," I said. "You signed off on those fines?" His pen froze mid-tap. He didn't answer right away, only adjusted his glasses and shifted a stack of papers to one side. His jaw clenched and his gaze dropped to the numbers in front of him, though I could tell he wasn't reading them. It was body language I'd seen in countless boardrooms during audits, the posture of someone who knew more than they could admit. "Look," Tom finally muttered, his fingers drumming on the desk now. "The board votes on everything. Patricia writes it up, we sign it. That's how it works." His explanation came out too quickly, like a script he'd rehearsed. His left leg bounced under the table, betraying nerves he couldn't hide. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "That's how it looks on the surface. But I've read enough of these newsletters to know something's buried in those budgets. And you know it too?" His eyes flicked up sharply, then back down again, as though afraid someone might be watching from the doorway. He shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking under his weight. "Ethan, I don't want trouble. Patricia, she doesn't take kindly to questions." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and his hands twisted the pen until the plastic creaked. That crack was all I needed. Tom wasn't blind to what Patricia was doing. He was caught in her net, tied up by fear. I watched his throat work as he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like he was trying to push down words he couldn't bring himself to say. He wanted to speak, but something in him held tight, chained by loyalty or self-preservation. "Tom," I said, keeping my tone steady, I know what it's like to feel cornered. But numbers don't lie, and they're pointing straight at Patricia. He blinked, lips parting as though a response was forming, but then his shoulders slumped. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and shook his head. I can't. Not here. Not now. His hands gave him away, though. They trembled slightly as he gathered the papers, stacking them with too much precision, aligning the corners like a man desperate for control over something. He wasn't dismissing me. He was protecting himself. The battle inside him was obvious. Duty versus fear, truth versus silence. I stood slowly, letting the legs of the chair scrape against the tile. His eyes darted up again, full of something unspoken. Regret, maybe, or warning. Either way, I'd seen enough. Tom was the crack in Patricia's armor, whether he admitted it or not. Fear might hold him back today, but fear also eroded slowly, piece by piece, until it broke entirely. As I left the office, the sound of his pen tapping started up again, faster, harder, a drumbeat of conflict he couldn't silence, and I knew, sooner or later, Tom would have to choose. The steady tap of Tom's pen still echoed in my head as I walked out of the office into the heavy night air. But whatever conflict he carried inside, Patricia carried none. By sunrise, she'd made her next move. A bright orange construction barrier had been planted at the edge of my dock, with bold black letters screaming, "Unsafe, do not enter." It wasn't just a notice now. It was a spectacle. Neighbors walking dogs slowed their pace, whispering behind hands. Kayakers drifted closer on the lake, pointing at the barricade like it was some crime scene. I stood there on the gravel, my fists tightening. Patricia hadn't just escalated the violation. She'd turned my father's dock into a public display of shame. That was her real weapon, humiliation. She knew most people in Clearwater Shores would rather surrender than have the spotlight aimed at them. But humiliation doesn't work on someone who's already buried a father, someone who's already fought to keep a legacy alive. The rumble of tires pulled me from my thoughts. A security truck, branded with the HOA logo, rolled up and parked crookedly at the end of my driveway. Two guards stepped out in matching polos and dark sunglasses, as if they were enforcing national security rather than petty rules. One of them snapped open a clipboard. "Mr. Ward, you are prohibited from accessing the dock until further inspection is complete. Violations will result in additional penalties." I couldn't help a dry laugh. "You mean until Patricia decides she's made her point?" The taller guard shifted uncomfortably, but he recited the line again like a robot. Their presence wasn't about safety. It was intimidation. Patricia had turned what should have been a neighborhood dispute into a theater production, and she'd cast me as the villain. But what she hadn't counted on was my refusal to play the role. I turned my back on them, letting the crunch of gravel under my boots say more than any words could. Inside, I grabbed the HOA newsletter again and spread it out across the kitchen counter, right beside my father's old fishing knife. The blade had dulled with age, but the handle was worn smooth from his grip. That knife wasn't just a tool, it was memory, a reminder that things built with integrity endure. Patricia wanted to break me with spectacle, but I would answer with substance. That afternoon, I drove to the community pool. It wasn't because I wanted to swim. It was because the poolside bulletin board was Patricia's stage. Every notice, every fine, every rule reminder got posted there, where the whole neighborhood gathered. I wanted to see just how far she'd push the narrative. Sure enough, a laminated sheet hung in the center. Ward Dock declared hazardous. Violation of HOA safety standards. Below it, a list of fines, already stacked up like daily bricks being laid against me. Residents lingered by the board, whispering. Some avoided my eyes, while others gave me quick, sympathetic nods before hurrying off. Fear was everywhere, thick and suffocating, but beneath it was something else. Frustration, quiet, bottled-up resentment. Patricia had overplayed her hand, and I could see it in the way people lingered just a little too long, reading those notices with clenched jaws. The pool was supposed to be a place of laughter, chlorine, and splashing kids. Instead, it had become her courtroom wall, and the community was the jury she couldn't control forever. As I stood there, I caught sight of Tom in the distance, walking briskly with a folder tucked tight under his arm. His head was down, his shoulders hunched. Even here, his body language screamed conflict. He didn't stop when he passed me, but his eyes flickered for a split second. Hesitation, guilt, maybe even a plea. Patricia might own the bulletin boards, but Tom carried something she couldn't control: the truth. I left the pool knowing one thing: Patricia had escalated the fight into a full-scale campaign, and if she wanted a spectacle, I'd give her one she could never erase. I left the pool that day with Patricia's laminated smear campaign burning in my mind. She thought the narrative was hers to control, but numbers don't bend to posters or rumors. By evening, I was sitting at the public library 2 towns over, where Clearwater Shores residents rarely ventured. I'd chosen the place deliberately: quiet, neutral ground, free from Patricia's shadow. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the low whir of copy machines, the kind of steady background noise that let me think clearly. I opened my laptop and pulled up the state's nonprofit corporation filings. Every HOA in Florida was required to maintain basic financial transparency, and those records weren't buried in basements or garages. They were online, public, and free. Most people ignored them because the documents looked dry, but to me, they were alive, breathing with patterns and stories. Scrolling through Clearwater Shore's annual filings, I spotted the line that made my chest tighten. Reserve fund balance, $4,212,876. A staggering number for a neighborhood of only 87 homes. My eyes narrowed. That kind of money wasn't just a cushion, it was an empire. And if Patricia was as sloppy as I suspected, pieces of it were already missing. I printed 3 years of budgets and highlighted where allocations didn't add up. Landscaping contracts ballooned without explanation. Special projects appeared in one report and vanished in the next. Entire expense categories rounded perfectly to the dollar. A detail no real-world invoice ever produced. To the average homeowner, it looked neat. To me, it screamed manipulation. The deeper I traced, the clearer the pattern became. A shell company name repeated across multiple contracts. Lakeside Maintenance LLC. I leaned closer to the screen, pulse quickening. Cross-referencing the company registry showed a manager listed, an out-of-town cousin of Patricia's. There it was. Money funneled out under the guise of maintenance, protected by the HOA's fear-driven compliance. I sat back in the stiff library chair, the air conditioning blasting against my skin. The discovery wasn't just numbers. It was proof of intent. Patricia hadn't just overstepped with fines and barricades. She'd weaponized fear to protect a $4.2 million scheme. And she'd built it on the assumption no one in this community would ever question her authority. My phone buzzed. A text from Marjorie. They posted another notice. Said you'll be fined $500 a day now. People are whispering, Ethan, they're scared. I exhaled slowly, staring at her words. Fear was Patricia's currency, but I'd just found the exchange rate. If the neighbors saw how she was siphoning their dues into a personal slush fund, that fear would flip into outrage. She wasn't fighting me over a dock anymore. She was protecting a secret empire. As the printer spat out another page, I noticed movement at the far corner of the library. Tom Delgado stood there, halfway hidden behind a shelf. His eyes darted nervously when he realized I'd spotted him. He hadn't approached me directly, but the way he lingered, fidgeting with the folder in his hands, told me he was watching for more than coincidence. He gave a quick nod before slipping out the side door, shoulders tight, head low. He wanted me to know he was paying attention, but he still wasn't ready to stand in the light. The weight of the paper stack felt heavy in my hands as I slid them into a manila folder. These weren't random reports anymore. They were ammunition. The kind Patricia couldn't cover with orange barricades or flashy notices. Walking out into the muggy night, I could feel the shift inside me. The dock had been personal, a wound ripped open by Patricia's arrogance. But this was bigger. She'd built her empire on stolen trust, and I was the only one with the skill set to expose it. The glow of the lake shimmered faintly in the distance, and I whispered to myself, Dad, this fight's not just for us anymore. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance as I walked back into Clearwater Shores, folder tucked under my arm. I'd uncovered enough to prove Patricia's empire was built on more than intimidation, but knowledge without action was just paper. I needed the community to see what I saw, and for that, timing mattered. Patricia thrived on spectacle, so if I wanted to crack her hold, I had to flip her stage into mine. By the next afternoon, she handed me the perfect opportunity. A mandatory community safety inspection notice was taped to my front door in glaring red ink. In small print at the bottom, dock to be assessed by HOA board, attendance required. Patricia was drawing her battle line in public, and she thought she'd chosen the ground. What she didn't know was that I had already mapped the terrain. When I arrived at the clubhouse, the air was thick with chlorine from the indoor pool and the faint buzz of gossip from gathered neighbors. The inspection looked more like a tribunal. Patricia stood at the center of the room in a tailored blazer, the kind that projected control. Beside her sat Tom Delgado, pale and tense, shuffling through a thin stack of papers. He didn't seem eager to show anyone. His leg bounced under the table, a tell I recognized instantly. Patricia's voice carried like a judge calling order. "Mr. Ward's dock has been deemed unsafe by the HOA board. Continued refusal to remove it puts the community at risk. We cannot allow liability to jeopardize Clearwater shores," the neighbors murmured, shifting uneasily in their seats. Liability. It was the word Patricia wielded like a weapon, implying their property. Values and insurance premiums might collapse if I didn't comply. She knew exactly how to stir their fear. I waited until the noise died down before stepping forward. "You want to talk about liability?" My tone was even, but it cut across the room like a blade. I held up the manila folder. "I've spent my career as a forensic accountant. I know how to read numbers most people overlook. And the real liability here isn't my dock. It's the $4.2 million in HOA funds funneled through companies tied directly to this board." Patricia's eyes narrowed, but her smile didn't falter. Wild accusations from a man trying to protect a dangerous structure. But the room had shifted. Neighbors leaned in, whispering, eyes darting between me and the folder in my hand. Patricia's mask of control cracked just slightly at the edges. For the first time, she was on defense. I laid a few sheets on the table, copies of budgets, highlighted in glaring yellow. "Round numbers on invoices? That doesn't happen in real accounting. A landscaping project listed at exactly $100,000, no breakdown of hours or labor, contracts awarded to companies registered to Patricia's cousin. This isn't speculation. It's a pattern." Patricia's knuckles whitened around her clipboard. "This is confidential board business. Homeowners don't have clearance to—" "Wrong," I interrupted. "Under state law, every homeowner has the right to inspect financial records. Transparency isn't optional, it's mandated." My voice carried not as a threat, but as fact, and that mattered more than volume ever could. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the nervous shuffle of Tom's papers. He glanced at me, eyes flicking between the highlighted reports and Patricia's tight jaw. His body language betrayed him, shoulders sagging, throat tight, lips pressed in a thin line. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He'd seen the same numbers, maybe even signed off on them, and the weight of that knowledge was eating him alive. Patricia gathered herself quickly, plastering on her smile again. "The board will review these concerns. In the meantime, the dock remains condemned." She turned to the officers stationed at the back of the room, signaling the meeting was over. But I'd seen what I came for. Not just Patricia's panic, but the crack widening in Tom's resolve. He couldn't keep hiding behind her shield forever. As I walked out into the evening air, neighbors clustered in small groups, their whispers no longer about my dock, but about money. About her. Patricia had escalated again, but so had I. And now, the neighborhood wasn't just watching. They were questioning. Neighbors still lingered outside the clubhouse when I walked away, their whispers buzzing like cicadas in the humid dusk. Patricia had held her smile in that meeting, but the seed of doubt was already planted. What she didn't know was that doubt spreads faster than fear. I was halfway to my truck when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Ethan!" a voice hissed. I turned to see Tom Delgado, clutching the same folder he'd kept shielded during the meeting. His face was pale, and sweat glistened on his brow despite the evening breeze. He glanced around, checking every shadow, like a man stepping outside a prison yard for the first time. We ducked into the parking lot, between two rows of parked cars. The sodium light overhead flickered, throwing us in and out of shadows. Tom pressed the folder to his chest, his fingers tightening like it might burst open if he let go. His shoulders were hunched, his breath shallow. "I can't keep doing this," he said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Every signature, every vote, I've been part of it, and I can't sleep anymore." I let him talk, saying nothing. The silence gave him permission to keep going. His eyes darted back toward the clubhouse doors, then settled on me. "You were right in there. The landscaping contracts, the rounded numbers, the cousins LLC, it's all real. Patricia makes it sound like routine maintenance, but it's a siphon. She tells us it's for the reserve fund and long-term community safety. But Ethan, that reserve isn't safe. It's bleeding." His hand shook as he opened the folder, the papers rattling in the night air. He pulled out a single page, sliding it toward me like contraband. My eyes scanned the numbers, and my pulse jumped. A transfer, nearly $200,000, authorized to Lakeside Maintenance LLC, routed through a separate account before being listed as playground improvements. The playground in Clearwater Shores hadn't been touched in over a decade. Tom's voice cracked. "She made me sign it. Said if I didn't, I'd be personally liable for any accidents, any lawsuits. Said my house, my savings, everything would be on the line if I didn't approve." His shoulders sagged, the folder slipping lower in his hands. "She's got everyone scared, Ethan. But I can't keep covering it." The weight of his words hung heavy, carried by the buzz of the flickering light. Tom's body betrayed the storm inside him, clenched fists one moment, wringing hands the next. His eyes were bloodshot, the kind that came from too many sleepless nights. Every tremor in his voice told me he'd been breaking piece by piece, and now the dam had cracked. I placed a hand on the folder, steadying it between us. "Tom, this is enough to prove she's been running a fraud. But I need you to stand with me when the time comes." I can't be the only voice. His lips parted, then pressed shut again. He swallowed hard, nodding once, but his eyes betrayed hesitation. "I'll get you what you need," he whispered, "but I'm not ready to stand in front of everyone yet. If Patricia finds out I came to you—" His voice trailed off, his throat tightening as though even finishing the thought was dangerous. "I understand," I said quietly, "but you've already done the hardest part. You didn't stay silent." Tom closed the folder quickly, hugging it to his chest again. His shoulders slumped, but there was relief in his posture now, like a man who'd unloaded a piece of a crushing weight. He took one step back, then another, fading into the shadows as though retreat was the only way to survive the night. I watched him go, the single page in my hand fluttering in the breeze. It wasn't just evidence, it was confirmation. Patricia's empire had cracks, and the treasurer himself had just handed me the first hammer. The parking lot fell quiet again, only the buzz of the sodium lamp breaking the silence. I slipped the page into my folder and whispered to myself, "Now it begins." The single page Tom had slipped into my hand still rustled faintly as I drove back home, the headlights carving through the humid Florida night. That transfer wasn't just a number, it was the key that could unravel Patricia's entire empire. But exposing it required more than slapping papers on a table. Patricia thrived on dismissing voices she labeled as troublemakers. If I wanted the neighborhood to believe me, I had to weaponize the very stage she used to control them, public perception. By morning, I knew where to begin. I parked outside the local diner in town, a small place with cracked red booths and a grease-stained chalkboard advertising all-day breakfast. It wasn't glamorous, but it was neutral ground, far from the HOA clubhouse Patricia controlled. More importantly, it was where locals gathered, where gossip stretched further than Clearwater Shores gates. If truth needed legs, this was where to give it a push. I slid into a booth by the window and spread the folder across the Formica tabletop. The waitress poured me coffee without asking, glancing curiously at the pile of papers. It didn't matter. Every curious glance here was an opportunity. I took out my phone and snapped photos of the transfer page Tom had given me, along with the rounded invoices I'd highlighted earlier. Each click of the camera was a step closer to daylight. With the images saved, I drafted a short post for a neighborhood social group online. Nothing wild, just enough to stir questions. Clearwater Shores. HOA lists $200,000 for playground upgrades. When's the last time you saw kids playing on new equipment? I attached the photo of the budget line. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with notifications. Comments poured in, confused, angry, some sarcastic. The spark had been struck, but I didn't stop there. Patricia could dismiss one homeowner's complaint as sour grapes. What she couldn't dismiss was documentation presented in a way the community couldn't ignore. I opened my laptop right there in the diner and began assembling a slideshow. Clean, simple, undeniable, year-over-year budget comparisons, duplicate contractor names, transfers vanishing into vague categories. Every slide built a narrative that pointed in one direction. Patricia. As I worked, I caught sight of Marjorie Lane walking into the diner with her terrier tucked in a bag. She spotted me and made her way over, curiosity plain on her face. "Ethan, what are you up to with all that?" I turned the laptop toward her. She leaned closer, adjusting her glasses, and when her eyes settled on the highlighted lines, her lips pressed tight. "Good Lord! We've all been paying into this for years, and she's been—" She shook her head, unable to finish. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "People will listen if you show them this. We're tired of being scared." Her words confirmed what I already felt. The community didn't need me to rant. They needed me to show them the truth in a way they couldn't look away from. Patricia's weapon was fear. Mine would be exposure. I saved the slideshow to a flash drive, tucking it into my pocket like a blade waiting for the right moment. The annual budget meeting was 2 weeks away, and Patricia would be front and center, projecting authority. That would be my moment to flip the stage. But between now and then, I'd need to make sure the truth had already circulated enough that no amount of her charm or intimidation could smother it. As I finished my coffee, my phone buzzed again. Another message in the neighborhood group. "Wait, why are we paying nearly $500,000 a year in landscaping when the lawns look like everyone's just mowing their own grass?" Dozens of replies followed, the kind of thread Patricia couldn't delete fast enough. I leaned back in the booth, watching the sunlight pour through the window and spill across the papers. For the first time in weeks, I felt momentum shift fully onto my side. Patricia had her barricades, her notices, her guards. But I had something she couldn't buy or bully, proof, and soon the entire community would see it. The sunlight streaming through that diner window had felt like a breakthrough, but by the next morning, Patricia made it clear she wasn't going down without a fight. A thick envelope arrived at my doorstep, stamped with the HOA's logo. Inside was a formal notice of legal action, a threat of lien, foreclosure, and recovery of all legal fees. It was theater dressed as law, but I knew her tactic well, drown the opposition in fear of losing everything. Most neighbors folded at this stage. I wasn't most neighbors. Instead of pacing my kitchen in frustration, I carried the envelope straight to my workplace downtown, a mid-sized accounting firm where I still consulted part-time. The office smelled faintly of toner and lemon disinfectant, the steady hum of copiers in the background. It wasn't glamorous, but it was familiar ground, a place where numbers weren't just digits. They were weapons sharpened by context. I spread Patricia's notice on my desk alongside the growing file of reports. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd accused me of putting the community at risk while she was siphoning funds under everyone's noses. That letter was her attempt to flip the narrative, to make me look reckless before I could make her look corrupt. But paperwork cuts both ways, and I was fluent in its language. I pulled up state statutes, cross-referencing homeowners' rights with HOA obligations. My fingers flew across the keyboard, years of audits training me to spot gaps faster than most attorneys. Within minutes, I'd underlined a section requiring HOAS to provide itemized financials upon written request. Patricia's notice wasn't just intimidation. It was a direct violation of transparency laws. If she wanted to drag me into court, she'd have to answer questions she couldn't afford. To solidify my case, I compiled a packet, side-by-side comparisons of the playground upgrades against actual county records showing 0 permits filed, landscaping invoices stacked against photographs of neighbors mowing their own lawns, reserve fund balances that ballooned without explanation, followed by sudden withdrawals. I wasn't just preparing to argue. I was preparing to corner. By late afternoon, I carried the packet to a friend who worked at the local news station. We met in a small coffee shop near the courthouse, the air thick with the smell of roasted beans and the hiss of the espresso machine. She leaned across the table as I slid the folder over. "You're telling me the HOA president of Clearwater Shores has a $4.2 million fund she's funneling through family companies?" "Not telling," I corrected. "Showing." She flipped through the pages, eyebrows climbing higher with each highlight. "Ethan, if this checks out, it's not just a neighborhood squabble. This is embezzlement." Her words were gasoline on the fire already burning inside me. Patricia thought she controlled the stage, but if this story broke in the press, her empire would be dragged into daylight before she even realized the curtains had lifted. Leaving the cafe, I felt the weight of both risk and resolve pressing down on me. Patricia wouldn't sit idle. She'd double down, threats, smear campaigns, maybe worse. But every move she made now would be in the shadow of what I was building. The neighbors were restless, the online chatter growing by the hour. Marjorie had texted me screenshots of group threads where homeowners demanded answers, their fear shifting into collective anger. And then there was Tom. He hadn't surfaced in slipping me that page in the parking lot, but I could feel his presence in every hesitation of Patricia's voice, in every stumble during the inspection. He was still inside her camp, still her treasurer, and that meant he was a fuse waiting for the right spark. When he lit, the whole board would burn with him. I packed the packet back into my briefcase, slid Patricia's threatening notice on top, and whispered to myself as I locked the office door, "Let her push harder. The harder she pushes, the louder the cracks will sound." I carried Patricia's notice back home like a trophy I hadn't asked for. It sat on my kitchen counter, the HOA logo glaring at me under the lamplight. But I wasn't rattled. I'd already planted seeds with the press, and Patricia's threats were nothing more than accelerants. Every letter, every notice she pushed onto me only made her look more desperate. The question now wasn't whether I'd expose her. It was how loud the reveal would be. The answer arrived sooner than expected. An official envelope slid under every door in Clearwater Shores. Annual budget meeting. Mandatory attendance. The gathering was scheduled for the community center auditorium, a cavernous space normally reserved for holiday parties and kids' recitals. Patricia wanted a stage big enough to silence me in front of everyone. What she didn't realize was that she'd just booked the theater for her own downfall. The night of the meeting, I walked into the auditorium carrying my briefcase. The air was thick with perfume, cologne, and tension. Rows of plastic chairs were already filled, neighbors leaning forward, whispering about rumors that had been swirling all week. Some nodded when they saw me, others looked away nervously. Marjorie sat near the front, her terrier curled at her feet, eyes fierce with quiet support. Patricia stood at the podium, polished as ever, her blazer catching the glare of the fluorescent lights. Flanking her were board members, each with their tidy stacks of paper. Tom sat among them, shoulders hunched, fiddling with his pen like he was trying to drill through the table. His eyes darted to me for half a second before dropping again. "Good evening," Patricia began, her voice warm but rehearsed. "We're here to review our annual budget, discuss community safety, and ensure Clearwater Shores continues to thrive. I expect civility and order as we move through the agenda." She glanced my way, her smile tightening just enough to reveal the steel underneath. This wasn't a meeting, it was a performance. But performances rely on scripts, and I had already written my interruption. When she moved to the line item on reserve fund allocations, I rose slowly. The scrape of my chair loud in the hush of the room. My briefcase clicked open. Every eye followed the sound. "Point of order," I said, my voice steady. "As a homeowner, I have the right to request clarification on budget allocations, particularly those exceeding $50,000. Patricia's smile didn't falter. "Mr. Ward, you've already been given notices regarding your violations. This meeting is not the place to air grievances." I stepped into the aisle, holding up a single sheet of paper, the transfer Tom had given me. "This isn't a grievance. It's a $200,000 transfer listed as playground upgrades. Tell me, Patricia, when was the last time any child here played on new equipment?" A ripple went through the room. Heads turned, whispers surged. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she leaned toward the microphone. "Those expenses were approved by the board. You are misinterpreting routine allocations. Then maybe you can explain, I said, sliding the next sheet onto the front table, why that payment went directly to a company managed by your cousin. The auditorium erupted, gasps, mutters, chairs creaking as neighbors leaned forward. Tom froze in his seat, the color draining from his face. Patricia slammed her gavel, her voice sharp now. Order! Order in this meeting. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The law gives every homeowner the right to review financial records. These records aren't optional. They aren't confidential. They're public, and I have copies for anyone who wants to see them. I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and held it high. Every document, every transfer, every pattern. Right here. The crowd buzzed louder, some already pulling out their phones, recording. Patricia's composure faltered. Her gavel strikes grew frantic. "This meeting is adjourned!" she barked, but the noise drowned her out. For the first time, she wasn't directing the play. She was losing control of the audience. As I stood there under the fluorescent lights, I could feel the tide turning. Patricia wanted to make me an example. She had. Just not in the way she intended. The room erupted into chaos the moment Patricia slammed her gavel and shouted adjournment. Neighbors stood, some shouting questions, others pulling out their phones to record. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us, hot and unforgiving, throwing shadows across the walls as if the whole building were trembling under the noise. This wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a reckoning. Patricia tried to stand tall at the podium, but her voice cracked as she barked for silence. "These accusations are baseless. Do not listen to this man." But the crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. They were listening to each other. 200 grand for a playground?" a man near the back shouted. "That place is rust and weeds." "My dues went up last year because of this reserve fund," another woman cried, her hands shaking as she waved her notice in the air. "Where's the money, Patricia?" Patricia's eyes darted wildly across the crowd, searching for support, but all she found were neighbors turning on her. She looked to the board members at her side. Most kept their heads down, papers shuffled as shields, all except Tom. He sat frozen, his pen trembling in his hand. His face was pale, his lips pressed thin, his leg bouncing beneath the table like a drumbeat of guilt. I stepped closer to the podium, raising my voice just enough to cut through the noise. "You want proof?" I held up the highlighted sheets. "Here are transfers made directly to a company managed by Patricia's own cousin. Landscaping, playgrounds, special projects. Money that never reached this community." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of the words pressing down on every person in the room. Dozens of phones lifted higher, recording every second. Patricia's mask cracked then. A bead of sweat slid down her temple as she leaned into the microphone, voice thin and brittle. "This is private board business. You don't understand the complexities of managing a community." "Private?" I snapped, my voice cutting her off. "These are our dues, our homes, our money. Nothing about this is private." Applause broke out, loud and sudden, echoing against the high ceilings. Marjorie rose from her seat in the front row, her terrier tucked under her arm, her voice carrying above the crowd. "We trusted you, Patricia. We trusted this board. But you've been bleeding us dry while calling it safety." The words seemed to ignite the room. People shouted, some demanding Patricia resign, others calling for audits, others swarming toward the front to get a closer look at the documents I held. Patricia pounded her gavel again, her polished nails clacking against the wood as though volume could restore control. But it was too late. And then, in the middle of the storm, Tom rose. His chair screeched across the floor. The sound silenced half the room. His hands shook as he gripped the folder in front of him, and for a moment, he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. But when he finally looked up, his gaze went not to Patricia, but to the neighbors gathered around. "It's true," he said, his voice breaking but clear. "What Ethan's showing you, it's all true. I've signed those transfers. I've seen where the money's gone, and I can't stay silent anymore." The gasp that rolled through the crowd felt like thunder. Patricia's face drained of color, her polished facade crumbling in an instant. She spun toward Tom, her voice sharp and desperate. "You don't know what you're saying. You're confused, pressured." But Tom shook his head, his hands finally steady as he laid the folder flat on the table. "No, I know exactly what I'm saying. I've been part of it. and I regret it." The crowd surged again, this time louder, angrier, their voices no longer whispers of suspicion, but declarations of betrayal. Patricia's gavel struck uselessly against the podium, drowned by the sound of her community turning against her. I didn't need to say more. The room itself had spoken. Patricia had lost the one thing she'd built her empire on: fear. And once fear collapsed, all that was left was accountability. The auditorium had become unrecognizable by the time Patricia slammed her gavel one final time. Neighbors no longer cowered in their seats. They crowded the aisles, voices raised, demanding answers. Phones filmed everything, beams of blue screens catching the panic on Patricia's face. She tried to bark for order, but no one obeyed. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was the accused. Tom stood straighter now, his confession still echoing in the charged air. His voice had broken the dam, and now the current was unstoppable. Board members glanced nervously at one another, shuffling papers as if the rustle could shield them. But the crowd wasn't looking at them. They were looking at Patricia, waiting for explanations that would never come. I stepped forward, laying the flash drive on the podium beside her useless gavel. "This isn't just about me or my doc," I said, projecting my voice to the back of the room. "This is about a $4.2 million reserve fund that's been siphoned into family-run companies while your dues kept climbing. It's about fear used as a weapon. And it ends tonight." The words rippled through the crowd like sparks on dry grass. Someone shouted, "Call the state attorney!" Another yelled, "We need a new board now!" The murmur turned into chants, neighbors clapping and stomping in unison, voices rising as one. "Resign! Resign! Resign!" Patricia's polished calm collapsed. Her hand shook as she grabbed the microphone, but her voice was drowned out by the chant that rolled like thunder through the auditorium. Her face flushed red, then pale, her eyes darting to the exits as though calculating her escape. For the first time, she looked small. Tom picked up the folder and placed it directly in my hands. The gesture was quiet, but it felt monumental. His shoulders sagged with relief, no longer bouncing with nervous energy. "Do what I couldn't," he whispered, and the crowd swallowed his words with their noise. The rest unfolded quickly. Neighbors demanded an emergency vote. Hands shot up, nearly unanimous. Patricia tried to protest, but her voice was nothing against the roar of her own community turning their backs on her. Within minutes, a motion passed to suspend her authority pending an external audit. She slammed the gavel again, but it only clattered hollow against the podium. The symbol of her control had become nothing more than wood. When I walked out of the auditorium, the night air hit me like a tide of freedom. Neighbors gathered around, some patting me on the shoulder, others asking questions, but all of them carrying the same expression: relief. Fear had cracked, and once it did, it didn't return. The following week, local news splashed the story across headlines. HOA, president under fire for $4.2 million, fund mismanagement. Reporters camped near the gates, cameras catching Patricia hurrying into her SUV, face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Investigators opened a formal review. For once, the scrutiny was on her, not on the homeowners she'd tormented. I stood at the edge of my dock that evening, the barricade long since removed, the orange plastic lying in shreds in the dumpster. The boards creaked softly under my weight, just as they had when my father built them. The lake mirrored the last streaks of sunset, gold fading into violet. For the first time in months, the water was quiet, undisturbed by threats or notices. This dock wasn't just wood and nails. It was memory, legacy, and proof that standing firm against tyranny, no matter how small it looked on paper, mattered. Patricia had tried to erase that legacy with fines and lies. Instead, her empire crumbled under the weight of truth. I let the silence settle, breathing deep, and whispered to the water, "We won, Dad." If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.